Madam President, as we close in now on 2 months since the Deepwater explosion that set off the Gulf oil spill, the toll of this disaster is continuing to mount. From the oil-soaked pelicans we see on the front cover of each newspaper every day, to the tar balls that dot a previously pristine coastline, closed fishing grounds, half-empty hotels, the human impact that's felt in Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, throughout the Gulf Coast region. This disaster has reached into our economy, into our environment, and the way that we see our energy future. But there is one place that it also threatens to reach, and that is into our pocketbooks. Madam President, when it comes to BP's promises to cover all the costs associated with this disaster, I'm sorry, but I am not ready to take them for their word. And that's because, as a senator from the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, I have seen firsthand what happens when big oil is allowed to make promises and not required to take action. When the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened in 1989, I remember it so well, that company assuring the public that the economic and environmental damage would be paid for. And then I remember fighting them tooth and nail all the way to the Supreme Court to deny fishermen and families from my home state the compensation they were due. So I'm not impressed by BP's promises, and I'm not ready to take the word of a company with a track record of pursuing profit over safety. Instead, I believe it's time for us to answer some very fundamental questions, like who should be responsible to clean this up? Who's going to bear the burden of big oil's mistake? Should it be the taxpayers, families, and small business owners who've paid such a high price already? Or should it be the companies who are responsible for this spill, including BP, that, by the way, is a company that made a $6.1 billion profit in the first 3 months of this year alone? Madam President, I co-sponsored the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act because, to me, the answer is pretty clear. I believe that BP needs to be held accountable for the environmental and economic damage of this spill, and I'm going to fight to make sure that our taxpayers do not end up losing a single dime to pay for this mess. To me, it's an issue of fairness. If an oil company causes a spill, they should be the one to pay to clean it up, not our taxpayers. This bill eliminates the current $75 million cap on oil company liability, so taxpayers will never be left holding the bag for big oil's mistakes. Straightforward, common sense, and fair. And I have to say, Madam President, I am extremely disappointed that this common sense bill continues to be blocked by the Republicans every time we've tried to bring it up. But I want everyone to know I'm going to keep fighting for the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act till we get it passed. But that alone is not enough in response. This week, I also signed on to a letter to BP's CEO asking him to back up the promises they're making to pay with action by requiring them to set up a $20 billion fund to begin covering the damages that we'll see. And it's also why I'm working to make sure this never happens in any other part of our country. I've always been opposed to drilling off the coast of my home state of Washington, and this tragedy is just one more painful reminder of the potential consequences of opening up the West Coast to drilling. The economic and environmental devastation caused by the Exxon Valdez disaster is still impacting people and families and businesses in my state. Washington State's coastal region supports over 150,000 jobs, and it generates almost $10 billion in economic activity, all of which would be threatened if drilling were allowed to happen off our West Coast. So I'm going to keep fighting for legislation that bans drilling off the West Coast and makes sure big oil companies are never allowed to roll the dice with Washington State's economy and environment. Madam President, we need to hold big oil accountable. We need to make sure that disasters like this never happen again. But we also need to remember the workers who were killed and injured in this horrific tragedy. We cannot forget that this is an issue that is larger than this one tragedy. The entire oil and gas industry has a deplorable record of worker and workplace safety. We've got to make sure that every worker is treated properly and protected, and that companies that mistreat their workers are held accountable. We know the oil industry is able to operate under stricter safety standards and regulations because they're already doing that in Europe, in Australia, and even in Contra Costa County in California, where that county has a set of stricter guidelines, and that has reduced their injuries and fatality rates for their workers. But we also know that worker safety should not be measured just by injury rates. We should be looking at reducing the dangerous conditions that exist, like fires and hazardous spills and release of toxic gases. When accidents do happen, we've got to record them, learn from them, and build on a program to prevent them from ever happening again. We've got to make sure our workers are treated with respect and their rights are protected. Like a lot of people, I was appalled last week to read reports in the Washington Post about BP's history of worker safety violations and numerous reports of worker intimidation. No worker should ever feel that reporting safety violations could endanger their job, and no company should ever pursue their bottom line in a way that endangers their workers. The Senate deserves answers from BP on worker safety conditions and how suppressing worker complaints could have contributed actually to this disaster. So I was extremely disappointed last week when I held a hearing in my subcommittee to examine worker safety issues in the oil and gas industry, and representatives of BP failed to show up, failed to even show up. Now, workers everywhere have to feel confident that their employers are putting their safety first, and companies that betray that trust have to be held accountable. So, Madam President, I'm going to keep working to make sure that happens, and I look forward to having future hearings that I hope BP will come to in the coming weeks so we can get to the bottom of this. Meanwhile, I'm going to continue fighting to keep drilling away from the Washington state coastline, and I'm going to keep pushing to make sure our taxpayers do not have to pay for the mistakes that big oil makes.